Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar hosted by the National Governors Associations for the Water Policy Learning Network and the Outdoor Recreation Learning Network, which both operate under the Center for Best Practices. This is Bevan Bucheister. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at NGA, and I'll be your moderator. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on NGA's website and sent to all registrants. We want this to be an interactive, so we encourage you to post questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, and you can find them on the lower part of your screen. Just click those boxes and we'll be monitoring them and posing your questions throughout the webinar. This webinar is focused on funding opportunities from USDA for source water protection, and these funds are primarily focused on providing safe drinking water and agricultural practices, but can also have additional benefits for outdoor recreation, as you'll see today. We chose this topic to respond to concerns of water advisors about how they will continue to make progress on improving water quality when state budgets are flat due to COVID-19. Coming up with state matching funds was a particular concern to our members. We're highlighting two projects today that also include recreational benefits tied to water quality, because outdoor recreation, as you all know, has become a lifeline for people across the nation as they look for some safe outlets during COVID-19. So I've asked the speakers to give you a brief background on NRCS conservation programs, and there are several of them. There's an alphabet soup of them, actually, and to share their insights and key strategies like partnerships that they use to come up with state matching funds to land dollars from these great programs. And finally, I asked them also to suggest what governors' water and outdoor recreation advisors can do to help land these federal dollars. So we're pleased to welcome our first speaker, and can you advance the slides to the first speaker? Oh. So these are, are the pictures of the speakers. So our first speaker is Jimmy Bramblett, who serves as the Chief Deputy for Programs, and that's Conservation Planning and Program Delivery with the Natural Resources Conservation Service for USDA. He's responsible for developing policies and procedures to invest the agency's more than $4 billion of technical and financial resources. So I know that number caught your attention. So Jimmy's here to help us unlock the keys of how to get those dollars into your states and get them on the ground and doing good things for water and recreation. He's going to give us an overview of the NRCS conservation grant programs and how the 2018 Farm Bill focused them on source water protection. He's held many roles with NRCS in several states before working his way up to headquarters, but I wanted to highlight some of his water credentials for you water advisors. And so early on in his career in NRCS with Georgia, he was the Assistant State Conservationist for Water Resources, also Water Resources Planning Team Leader, and a Water Quality Specialist, so he knows his water issues. Our next set of speakers will give us some insight on landing NRCS funds for a major project in Springfield, Illinois. We're pleased to have Ted Meckes, the Water Division Manager of Springfield, Illinois City Water, Light, and Power. Ted coordinates long-term planning for water system improvement projects, in addition to overseeing the daily operations. So also under his purview are supplemental water supply projects and major infrastructure enhancements and long-term growth planning. He will be joined by Ivan Dozer, the Illinois State Conservationist for USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Prior to becoming state conservationist, Ivan held many roles with Illinois' NRCS, including county soil scientist, soil conservationist, district conservationist, American Indian liaison, and assistant state conservationist for programs. And then we'll be joined by Matt Unruh, the Chief of Policy and Communications at the Kansas Water Office. Matt is also the project lead for the Milford Lake Water Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP project. He'll give us insights on landing funds for a major project in Kansas to address harmful algal blooms that are damaging a major drinking water source and recreation area. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Jimmy Bramblett for the overview of NRCS grant programs for source water protection.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, Bevan, and good afternoon to all of you out there across the landscape. Thank you for inviting NRCS to be part of this dialogue this afternoon. And we really appreciate the chance to share with you a little bit about who we are. A lot of folks understand that USDA and think about USDA primarily from a farm production perspective, but what I'm going to do today here is talk a little bit about who we are and what we offer here. So next slide. And beginning with who we are, let's go on to the next slide. So we have recently updated our mission and vision statement, but we've kept a motto that we have, and that is really simply helping people help the land. And this slide here shows that we've been in business for 80 years. That slide is 5 years old. We now have been in business for 85 years. So next slide, please. And the interesting thing about the way NRCS is developed, we have offices, over 2,500 offices actually, all throughout the country. And so not only do we have some capacity in the form of state offices to work with your counterparts, whether they're the Natural Resources, Department of Natural Resources, or the Water Quality Agency, the Clean Water Administrator, the State Drinking Water Administrator, the State Forester, the State Historic Preservation Officer, the State Wildlife groups. We expect our state conservationists to sit in our state offices, and Ivan Dozier's on the line here today to amplify that a little bit, to have those personal relationships at that level, and then really help with local water utilities and others closer to the ground, identify and prioritize what kind of conservation investments that we need to be making from a taxpayer perspective. The key thing about all of these offices is that we as an agency have a unique program delivery system with this amongst all of the federal government. Only the post office probably has more offices than we do. And then the other part of it from the federal government perspective is everything we offer is voluntary based. And so when an issue comes up, we generally ask folks to start with our local field office, and we have an organizational structure that works its way up through an area office, to our state office, to some regional offices of multiple states, and then to our national office. Next slide, please. So what do we offer in all these offices? Let's go on to the next slide. And then I'll try to summarize this as best I can. It's hard to talk about the wide variety of activities that NRCS pursues and the things you all might be interested in just a matter of 10 minutes. But on the right-hand side of this slide, I just wanted to make sure and maybe make a little bit of a connection with some of you that we actually are the agency that's mapped soil surveys all across the country. In fact, we're the only country in the world that has wall-to-wall soil survey information. We also have a plants database to help with local, will help everybody, research community, others, landowners, outdoor recreation specialists, and others deal with and understand what kind of plants they need, what kind of plants they have, to help with planning some of their objectives and meeting their needs. And then for condition of the land, we have a responsibility every 5 years to report to Congress, what is the condition of the land in this country? How much of it is an urban area? How much of it is water? How much of it is still in cropland? How much is pasture, et cetera, et cetera? We call that the National Resources Inventory, and we update that every 5 years. And for those of you in the West, we play a really critical role in our snow survey and water supply forecasting activities. And that really helps a lot of states figure out how they're going to manage water when there's an abundance of it, snowfall, and that is in the winter, or there's a lack of it. And so it's really an advanced tool that offers tremendous amount of insight to governmental activities throughout the western part of the country. On the left-hand side, that's what a lot of folks, particularly in the rural parts of the country, know us for. It's our one-on-one conservation planning activities, helping individual landowners identify what kind of natural resource concerns they might have. And when I say natural resource concerns, I'm talking about things like soil erosion, water quality, wildlife habitat that might be on their farm and then might be also going off of their property and impacting other areas. And so we prescribe a series of conservation practices to help address those resource concerns that are identified and to meet those objectives of that individual landowner. We do that through a variety of programs. We won't have time to get into here today in detail, but those programs manifest themselves in the form of financial assistance to individual landowners and a variety of programs that are offering assistance to partners and then offering assistance to eligible communities. So the next slide, please. We have, I'll show you 4 categories of programs, but we have about 23 different programs. And one of the things that's interesting and we're excited about actually in the 2018 Farm Bill is a new provision associated with source water protection. And when I was talking about conservation practices on the last slide, one of the things I could mention is the fact that we have over 170 different types of conservation practices and another 150 conservation enhancements. And about a third of those are dedicated to water quality as a means of addressing resource concerns. So As was mentioned at the beginning of our program, we have as an agency somewhere about $4.5 billion as an agency that we administer. Roughly $3 billion of that is direct financial assistance to individuals and communities, and about a third of that, so about $1 billion, is really dedicated to some water quality related activities. Next slide, please. So as a result of that provision, that new statutory provision in the Farm Bill, which actually is dedicating a minimum of about 10% of our overall funding, not just for water quality, but all funding of the agency be dedicated to water quality and source water protection. We have been reaching out here recently at the national level with EPA and a couple of other associations to make sure that that consideration in the Farm Bill gets integrated throughout our delivery system and through all of our partnerships as much as we possibly can. NRCS thrives off of partnerships. Although we have 2,500 offices out there, we only have about 8,000, 9,000 employees. And so all of the things we do, excuse me, we can't do without having a lot of really, really good partnerships nationally, at the state level, and at the local level. Next slide, please. So everything we do follows this very complicated slide that I'm not going to walk through. I just have to reiterate something that was on one of the earlier slides, and that's we're science-based. So the good thing is, as we work either with an individual or we work at the watershed scale, we're bringing the best available science and technology to a formal process. We call it our conservation planning process, in order to help identify, scope down to what those resource concerns, what those landowner or community objectives are, going through and using the best scientific tools to inventory, analyze what's taking place out there on the ground, and then identifying alternatives to address those that not only meet the resource considerations, whether in this particular case it be source water protection or outdoor recreation and wildlife habitat, but also meet those landowner objectives as well, or those community objectives. So next slide. So as a part of this whole source water protection provision of the Farm Bill, what we've asked our state conservationists to do is to begin enhancing that relationship with our state safe drinking water administrators. And most states have many offices at an area level below the state before they get to the individual county level. And so we've asked them to have their delivery system within the state make connections with public water systems and interested utilities, make them aware of this provision of the Farm Bill, look at, scope out, identify areas that might offer some additional focus for conservation delivery. There's certain provisions in the Farm Bill that give us an opportunity to accelerate the amount of financial investments that we offer to individual landowners. And then we have other programs that I'm not even going to have time to talk about that would bring in communities of interest and complement these individual landowner programs as well. Next slide, please. So as we've talked about trying to have our state conservationists engage with those leaders at the state level, what we're also encouraging some of these national partners is to work through their social networks, whether it's the Safe Drinking Water Administrators or the American Water Works Association, make them aware that NRCS by statute is a locally led organization. We call it locally led conservation. And it's kind of interesting when you think about it, as a federal agency with a delivery system like we have, bringing the technical science-based information that we bring, having $4 billion, all of it has to be done in a voluntary fashion and directed by priorities that start at the local level. So there is an organizational structure in place in each state. Our state conservationist takes input and advice from the state technical committee, and then figures out how to balance out all the competing demands and meet those needs at the state level. Next slide, please. They use this, they being the state conservationists, which, by the way, from our organizational structure, have a tremendous amount of authority, a tremendous amount of autonomy. You might think of it as similar to what a regional administrator has with EPA. It's that much latitude that we give to our state conservationists because of this locally led provision. But we have basically the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, which is designed to address specific resource concerns with individual landowners. In the lower right-hand side of the screen is the Conservation Stewardship Program. That's really for those that have addressed resource concerns and are interested in higher levels of stewardship. We help put conservation practices and enhancements on the ground there. In the upper right-hand corner, we have the what we call ACEP, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. That retires land, doesn't retire land, it actually puts land into an easement, maintains land ownership. Many times that land is being worked by a farmer under a concept called ALE, and many times it's under a process or a land type we call wetlands for wetland reserve easements. And then in the lower left-hand side of the screen, we have RCPP. Again, we talked about NRCS thriving off of partnerships. So RCPP is our marquee program to leverage resources that are not federal or not NRCS based to help address resource issues and concerns at larger geographic scales. There are a couple of other programs based off of the audience here that I would note, and that is our WATERSHED programs, where we can there's actually some very specific provisions to do outdoor recreation work there. We work through eligible sponsors. Eligible sponsors are those individuals, or rather those entities that have revenue generating capacity and the power of eminent domain. So we have a lot that we can bring to the table, not only for source water protection, but for a lot of other issues, a lot of other opportunities, as we're told many times that are faced at the governor's office and many of the state agencies that are dealing with these issues. We can be a partner in helping address many of those and find solutions and work and leverage resources to the benefit of everybody involved. Next slide, please. Very good. So that takes care of my time, and I think what I'll do, Bevan, is turn it back over to you to transition, and I guess we're going to do questions at the end.
Sure. I just wanted to ask you, Jimmy, if you could elaborate a little bit on that watershed programs and the eligible sponsors, and that was the one that applied to, outdoor recreation work. And so you mentioned that they had to be a revenue generating entity. So can you just tell us what that means in, in plain English, or give us some examples?
Yeah. So my apologies for always being in government speak sometimes, but so this is actually one of our older programs. It was established back in the 1950s, and it's called PL 566 affectionately for a lot of folks that are familiar with it. But it's the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act, and the statute is basically a page. And so it gave us a lot of latitude to put into the regulation what we needed to do to help administer that program. And in there, virtually everything else we can do with all the other programs is available for work with both individual landowners and with these eligible sponsors. So an example of an eligible sponsor might be a city or a county or a water authority or some other unit of state government that might have those same capacities to bring resources to the table, because all of these programs do require some form of cost share. And under this watershed program, we can address water quality issues, we can address soil erosion issues, but there's some very specific provisions about us being able to build recreational facilities. And the authority originally was limiting us to 250,000 acres or less. The idea is that we would do the smaller watersheds and the Corps of Engineers would do the larger geographic scale activities. There's been some recent statutory movement to give us some additional flexibility there, but it is a unique capability that we have from a statutory perspective. We haven't used it in recent years, but it is there, and we do have over 12,000 structures, watershed structures, lakes, if you will, some of which have camping and outdoor recreation facilities attached to them that help address and actually provide a lot of economic input into some rural parts of various states.
All right, well, I think we'll follow up with you and get some more information on that, and possibly a list of projects that were funded prior to this year to give some examples out to our network.
Absolutely, also, happy to help.
And I also wanted to ask you, when you bring in different partners to land these grants, and especially the RCPP grants that are not more oriented to go to the farmer for on-farm practices, but when you're bringing in partners for those larger projects, do the partners always need to bring dollars to the table, or do they bring some other in-kind technical assistance, or what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good clarifying question. So the goal of that program is to have at least the 1-to-1 match, and what we realized, it started in the 2014 Farm Bill, and for the first 5 years of the program, we have been running a match rate at about 2-to-1. The demand for that program is very, very high. And the partners that were interested in seeing it continue in the 2018 Farm Bill gave it its own authorities. And basically what I'm saying there and putting that in layperson's terms means is we can do virtually anything else we can do with any other program in the agency under RCPP. The match, we do look at cash match and give priority to that, but that doesn't mean that we don't accept a lot of projects that have in-kind and other forms of match as well.
And is priority given to projects that that provide multiple benefits, like, you know, like for drinking water, source water protection, and then recreation, or is that just another add-on?
I'll tell you what, I should, if I could have just written these questions down and given it to you, I don't know if I could have done any better, but Congress is actually under this program in the Farm Bill had some very specific language in a term we call outcomes. You and I know that as benefits. And for years, and just to back up a little bit from the history of our agency, we went in 2003 as a $750 million organization to 2004, a $4 billion organization overnight. And we did that with no additional staff. So it speaks to the amazing abilities of our folks in the field office. But what we do associated with all that is we report how many folks we're helping, how many acres we're treating with conservation, and how many dollars we're obligating for the past 16 years. Congress has said that's great information, but not good enough. So we want to see outcomes. And what that means is we have to describe or prescribe now, as we're working on our agreements with RCPP partners, what those outcomes look like, what those benefits look like. And so the more benefits that are associated with those projects, the higher consideration it gets in the competition process.
All right, that's great to know. That's great to know. So I would encourage all the outdoor rec people on the line and our network to work with the state conservationists and also the water utilities to get in there and justify some of these programs that give multiple benefits. So that's great to know. So we're going to move on now and invite Ted Meckes to come in and tell us what one of these projects looks like on the ground and how they formed partnerships to land it and what kind of benefits it's going to bring. So Ted.
All right, thank you, Bevan. As Bevan said, my name is Ted Meckes. I'm the Water Division Manager for a municipally owned water and electric utility in Springfield, Illinois. Well, thank you, Bevan. Can you hear me? Hello?
Hey, Ted, this is Timothy. I can hear you.
I have control. Can you, next slide, please? Okay, Springfield is located in central Illinois. We are the state capital. Lake Springfield is a drinking water source for some 150,000 people surrounding, including Springfield and some surrounding communities. It's a major recreational lake for one of the best fishing lakes in central Illinois, and a lot of boating traffic as well. The lake was constructed in the late 30s or the mid 30s, has a watershed of approximately 170,000 acres, of which 74% is agriculture. So we're very heavily influenced by ag. We have over 400 farmers in our watershed. Next slide, please. What are some of the challenges in water treatment? Well, related to agriculture, there's herbicides, pesticides, sediment, nitrates, atrazine, and not related to agriculture is corrosion control, lead service lines, and PFAS compounds, which we're not really going to talk about today. But in water treatment, there's the multi-barrier approach. You can't rely on just filters or clarification. You need a multi-barrier approach to get the best water quality. And of course, your first barrier is protecting your source. Next slide, please. Lake Springfield, well, one of the two tributaries to Lake Springfield, Sugar Creek, is listed on the IEPA's 303D list, impaired for total phosphorus. Lake Springfield itself is on the 303D list for total phosphorus, total suspended solids, and algae. What is the source for all these impairments? Well, mostly agricultural. There's a few golf courses and a little bit of forest runoff. Next slide, please. Well, back in 1982, we decided we need to do something. And that's 47 years without really doing anything in our source water protection. So we developed a team in the 1990s, but we quickly realized we can't do this alone. It's too great of a task for a water provider to do that by themselves. So we teamed up with our Sangamon County Soil and Water Conservation District. Next slide, please. And we developed what we call our Lake Springfield Watershed-Based Resource Management Plan. This plan was first developed in 1990. It was revised in 2012, and then again in 2017, which is our most recent version. And it details the resource concerns we have, mitigation measures, and costs for posing those mitigation measures, as well as timeline for all that actions. Next slide, please. As I said, we can't do this alone. So as you can see from this list, we have a multitude of partners, some governmental agencies, IEPA, Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, Illinois Department of Natural Resource, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the ag community, local colleges, and many other, our homeowners association around the lake. There's many partners, and we're always welcoming more. Next slide, please. So what were those resource concerns? Well, we don't want to just pick on ag. So we also looked at urban issues. Most of Springfield is not in the Lake Springfield watershed, but there are probably about a third of it is. And then we have a few smaller communities in our watershed. So we looked at erosion control, stormwater management, installation of sewers, sanitary sewer around the lake, and shoreline erosion. Those are the easy tasks. We created an ordinance for erosion control in our community to help mitigate, subdivisions and things from entering our, silt entering our lake. Stormwater management, we designed retention ponds for subdivisions and developed areas. We're working diligently on removing all the septic systems around our lake. We have about 726 leased properties, and we're down to about 320 on septic. So we're getting there pretty rapidly. And shoreline erosion, we do about 2,000 feet of shoreline a year around our lake. But the main source, agriculture. So those issues, sediment and nutrients. Next slide, please. Sediment. Through our watershed plan, it was determined that 94% of all the sediment entering Lake Springfield comes from runoff from land. And as you can see from this picture, that bare black dirt, or ground in this case, is what gets into our lakes. We need to figure out a way to stop that. Most of our cropland in the Lake Springfield watershed, in fact, 3/4 of it is conventionally tilled, meaning they disc it up every year. We estimate about 160,000 tons of sediment entering our lake each year, of which 94% is from the ag. Next slide, please. Some of the practices that we look at, grass filter strips, grass waterways, cover crops, but one of the big ones is conversion to a no-till practice. Of our 170,000 or so acres, it's about 130,000 are farmed. We could put no-till on approximately 109,000 acres. That would have some major reductions in nitrogen, which is a nitrate issue for water treatment plants, phosphorus, and sediment to the tune of about 58,000 tons a year. That's almost over a third of the sediment entering the lake that we could get rid of by just converting to no-till. Next slide, please. Well, the issues we face as water providers, we're not farmers. We're engineers, we're chemists, we're water operators. We don't understand the agricultural incentive programs that Jimmy mentioned, the EQIP, the CSP, the CRP. We don't understand that terminology, And one thing I can say, one of our partners is NRCS that attends every one of our watershed meetings, our local agent, Hal Pyle. So, you know, we need that help from the NRCS to accomplish our goals. But what are the solutions? Well, first, as a surface water supply especially, you need to form a watershed committee and you need to develop these partnerships. And you need to reach out as far as you can and get anyone you can to be a part of that solution. And then the major thing we need to do is secure funding. Next slide, please. You know, the old adage, money can't buy happiness. Well, in our case, it's the only thing that will buy happiness for the water provider and the farmer. Next slide, please. And how do we go about that at City Water, Light and Power? Well, as you can see from this slide, we go after the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency 319 funding. And this funding is a 60-40 split between the EPA and the city. It's usually a 2-year program. And we've received over the past 17 or so years about $1.4 million. And we continue to try for this funding opportunity every 2 years. Next slide, please. And one of our more recent ones is the National Water Quality Initiative. This funding agreement is with the NRCS. And Jimmy talked about this a little bit. We're going to get about $136,000 a year for 3 years in one of our sub-watersheds. It's a smaller watershed that is one of our critical sub-watersheds. We targeted that so that we can put some best management practices, which I have listed below there, on the field, in these farm fields to help these farmers get this project started so we can show some progress. This is a great program. We're excited to start it. Next slide, please. And then the Resource Conservation Partnership Program, the RCPP, which Jimmy talked about. Again, this is from the 2018 Farm Bill, is our agreement. This is AWWA, American Water Works Association, worked with the USDA and federal legislators to get this accomplished. And I have to give USDA and AWWA a lot of credit to get this done. The American Water Works Association, all the water providers, have received a lot of heat over the years for toxic algae blooms. And I think this agreement and this amount of money will actually help hopefully alleviate some of that. City Water, Light and Power received about $1.3 million over the next 5 years. We're the lead agency on this and our lead partner, and we have 10 other partners to help us with this, and that's growing. I want to thank Shannon Allen for all his assistance he's done getting this. We couldn't have done it without him. Next slide, please. So our goals, what can we do to, you know, reach our goals? What do we have to do? Well, we need to continue to work on urban erosion and stormwater management. We can always get better with that. We need to continue to replace septic systems with sanitary sewer. But we really need to minimize that agricultural runoff to alleviate our sediment and nutrient concerns. We need to do that by promoting these best management practices, or BMPs, eliminate that bare black soil with strip till, no-till cover crops, install those filter strips in grass waterways to get that sediment stop that from entering our water supply. Next slide, please. What do I expect and what's the city expect from this? Well, an improved lake water quality for recreation. You hear all the time, I don't want to swim in that lake. It looks dirty. Well, if we can minimize that problem, we can do a few things, you know, improve the habitat for fish, minimize bacterial growth in our lake, and eliminate toxic algae blooms. That's one of the most important things. Swimmers don't want to swim where they can get sick. We can improve lake water quality for water treatment purposes, reduce the amount of chemicals we use. We do not have the ability to treat for nitrates in our treatment plant, and we don't want to get to that point. So we need to put our money where our mouth is out in the watershed so that we never have to get to that. We want to be able to not spend money on atrazine issues. And then we can reduce our dredging costs. It's going to cost us about $25 million to dredge our lake in the next 5 years. But what we want to do, we know we can't eliminate sediment from entering the lake. We want to minimize it so that that 20, 30-year dredging cycle ends up being 50, 60 years. So you only have to spend that half as much. And then we want to reduce the hypoxia zone, do our part in reducing the hypoxia zone in the Gulf by reducing the nutrient loading leaving our watershed. That's very important. But one of the other things we want to do with this is eliminate the pressure to regulate agriculture. Agriculture did with this toxic algae blooms, they're getting some heat. So we need to really eliminate that by doing these on-field practices and helping the farmers. They need to make money, so helping them with these financing options to get these best management practices on their field. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ivan. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ted, and good day, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this forum, and thanks for your interest in conservation solutions when it comes to source water protection. I'm just going to leave this slide up here because what I would like to do is just reinforce some of the points that Jimmy and Ted, and as they relate to our NRCS programs, and of course the importance of having a strong partnership. I can confirm from personal experience the long-standing partnership NRCS has had with City Water, Light and Power in Springfield, because I was a young soil conservationist back there in the mid-1980s, and I worked on a watershed project on that Lick Creek arm, which is the northern arm of the lake. It was a Public Law 566 project that Jimmy mentioned. And then in the Sugar Creek arm, the lower arm of the lake, they had some funding that was coming from EPA, actually comes down from US EPA, that Section 319 funds. And then there were even some local funds there, but it was to target soil erosion out there, because that was one of those things that that it was negatively impacting the lake's water volume, and they were having to do a dredging project there. And then there was also some negative impacts on recreation for boating, fishing, and swimming, as Ted mentioned. And it's not uncommon here in the Midwest for us to see these public water supply lakes that have about 70 to 80% of the watershed land use devoted to agriculture. So this one's right there in the middle of that with about 74%. So what that means is everything that's happening out there on that farmland, everything that's applied to the land, and including the land itself in the form of sediment, it has the potential to end up in the lake at high enough levels to cause a problem. And so that dredging project that they had in Lake Springfield, it was all over the news. And so it was a good reminder for the farmers out there to see the impacts that their operations were having on other people. And it's interesting to note that in this particular watershed, most of the land isn't what we would consider notable land. So it's not subject to conservation compliance, which is kind of a quasi-regulatory thing in the Farm Bill as well. But most of the farmers also weren't experiencing excessive erosion, except for maybe what we would call the sheet and reel erosion. But again, still a considerable amount of soil moving. And when you have a watershed that's big and over that large area and over a long period of time, it was indeed a problem. And again, that strong partnership, even though it wasn't formalized at that time, that strong partnership and good pre-planning did help address that issue. Springfield also serves as a good example that resource concerns can change over time. So there's no such thing when it comes to conservation as a set it and forget it when it comes to conservation practices. And also, as Ted mentioned, so it was about a decade later when a new issue arose. And I was in the county just south of there, down in Macoupin County, as a district conservationist when the atrazine issue came up. And again, that's a herbicide that farmers were applying to the land, and the allowable concentration levels changed, and it turned out that there were several public water supply lakes in these agriculture that were experiencing that problem with atrazine. But once again, that strong partnership was able to pull together and help address the issue. And now again, as Ted mentioned, excess nutrients are showing up as that #1 concern. And again, that partnership's pulling together. And that kind of serves as another example of when we talk about funding for these projects. It's not like you just get one shot. at that brass ring. Resource concerns change. Our programs can be used. We just don't just look at it one time. Oh, they got money 10 years ago and now they've got another problem. That's not the way that those work. So as Jimmy mentioned, there are a lot of funding opportunities out there from USDA, and we have more opportunities now than ever than we had before to target some of these funds. And so I'd like to make one final point, both about the funding and the partnerships. And Ted mentioned this a little bit too, talking about how important it is to get funding. And indeed it is. And I hear from a lot of the groups that they think getting funding to implement a plan is the most difficult part of the process. But I'm actually going to tell you my experience is that once you get that funding, a bigger issue is making sure that the funds that you do get are effectively used so they can have a real impact. A strong partnership is important to that, but so is that strong planning process that Jimmy talked to. And we kind of have a formula for how those plans work, but I've got to tell you that the process needs to include all of the stakeholders as part of an information and education campaign, and also as a part of assisting ideas for a solution. And that's kind of what Jimmy was talking about when he was talking about locally led holders. I mean, everyone who's interested, and interest just might be wanting to do something, but it also could be people that are opposed to your idea of doing something. And there could be a lot of different reasons. Again, I remember, Ted, even back with the first dredging, there were some environmental groups. You would think they would be all for doing things out there in the lake, but they didn't like to see the dredging. They didn't like that activity. And it's a whole lot better if you know that right up front and they're part of the process than to actually get funding and get things rolling along and you're ready to go, and then somebody steps up and delays implementation because they're opposed. As Jimmy also explained, many of our program funds, they do go directly to the farmer, and they're there to help offset the expense and the risk of adopting conservation practices. So when we talk about stakeholders, it's imperative to include the farmers in all phases of that planning process. You might have heard that old cliche, we're from the government and we're here to help. And I can tell you from experience, that doesn't go over well with farmers. And even if it's not the government that is the local face of the project, I can tell you farmers still don't like it if someone comes up and says, we've got some good news and some bad news. And the bad news is we've determined that you're causing a problem. But the good news is we have a solution for you. So they don't like that either. And I can tell you that incentives alone won't persuade enough of the farmers to change their tried and true methods of farming. And that's kind of that voluntary part. And Ted even mentioned, well, in the municipality part, you can just deal with regulations. Farmers don't like regulations either, but sometimes that can be used as a stick to help encourage them to see that maybe adopting these practices voluntarily is a good idea and can help offset some of that cost and offset some of that risk. So NRCS, I just
so
need
Ivan,
to
Ivan, I'm going to have to wrap it up, to help you wrap it up, because we still have to get to Matt. Okay, great, good timing.
I was just going to say that NRCS, we can help with the planning, the conservation practices, and the funding. But just as Ted said, we can't do it alone either. And so we've got a lot of good examples, though. When you follow a formula, we can have success, and Lake Springfield's one of those. So thanks again, and again, your interest.
Thanks, Ivan. And this is Bevan. I just wanted to point out that, like Ted had pointed out, and I want to put a finer point on it, that it's really important to connect with your state conservationists, because they know the groups that are already put together. And if the outdoor rec or the water policy advisors know some other groups, local groups that have resource concerns, this is where you can serve to connect those to the state conservationist and grow the partnerships to give yourselves a better chance of landing these grants, or to even help the state conservationists can help you figure out which grants that you should be applying for, or the partners should be applying for. So really key person to get in touch with in your state. And we will be sending out a link to the list of all the state conservationists to our networks after this webinar, with some other resources as well. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Matt Unruh, and he's going to tell us about the project that he leads in Kansas that has drinking water and also outdoor recreation implications. So Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Bevan. And thank you to the National Governors Association for this opportunity to spend the next few minutes discussing the Milford Lake Watershed Regional Conservation Partnership Program project in Kansas. And I think I've got control of the screen, so I am going to try to move ahead here. Whoop, what just happened? Let's try it from this point.
All right, looks good. Thanks.
So yeah, sorry about that. I guess starting out, giving a little bit of information regarding the watershed and background itself of Milford Lake. Milford Lake is a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers reservoir located just outside of Junction City in the Fort Riley area in north central Kansas. Milford Lake has federally authorized purposes of flood control, water quality, water supply, of which the Kansas Water Office and the state of Kansas owns a portion of that water supply storage. Navigation, as far as releases made for Missouri River navigation downstream from the Republican River on into the Kansas River, as well as recreation and fish and wildlife. The lake itself has an estimated capacity of around 370,000 acre feet and at roughly 15,700 surface acres in size at the top of conservation pool. It is the largest lake in Kansas. Milford Lake is a very popular lake in Kansas for both fishing and boating. The lower Republican Basin, of which Milford Lake is at the lower end of, is approximately 1.25 million acres in size and largely rural in nature. Approximately 50% of the lower Republican Basin is cropland and around 37% is grassland, making agriculture very prevalent within this area. For the purposes of this particular RCPP project, we are focusing on the lower Republican Basin, but the entire Republican River Basin itself continues on north and west from this area into southern Nebraska, northwest Kansas, and northeast Colorado. So this is a very large river basin itself, but for the purposes of this project, really focusing on that lower end in the lower Republican Basin. The primary water quality issue of concern which prompted development of this RCPP project is harmful algal blooms on Milford Lake. For a number of years, harmful algal blooms at Milford have impacted lake-based recreation as well as impacted utilities using water from the lake. Dating back to 2010, when the Kansas Department of Health and Environment first started monitoring and issuing public health watches, warnings, and closures for the presence of harmful algal blooms in waters across the state, Milford Lake has had from 29 HAB days, or days in which public health advisories have been issued because of the presence of harmful algal blooms, on up to 136 in 2016. So ranging from 29 in 2013 up to 136 in 2016. For reasons not completely known right now at this time, no harmful algal blooms were observed during 2018, 2019, and 2010, which was the first year of KDHE's HAB monitoring program. So there could have been some blooms present, but they just went undetected when that program was first getting started up. The summer of 2020 has seen harmful algal blooms return to Milford Lake, with portions of the lake being in HAB warning status at the present time. Milford Lake is also on the 303D list of impaired waters for eutrophication and low dissolved oxygen. And the lower Republican Basin itself is listed for fecal coliform bacteria, low dissolved oxygen, total phosphorus, and total suspended solids. So there are a number of water quality issues that have and continue to be a priority to address within this particular portion of Kansas. Milford Lake also serves an important role as a raw water source for a number of downstream water users. The map shown it highlights water supply users in the northeast part of Kansas, as well as the two reservoirs Kansas owns water marketing storage within, showing up as basically the gold areas there, Milford with the marketing program customers there, and then Clinton Lake closer to Lawrence. Releases from Milford Lake, which sits just above the confluence of the Republican and Smoky Hill rivers, where the Kansas River begins, travel downstream along the Kansas River into high population area of Kansas. Cities such as Topeka, Lawrence, which is home to the University of Kansas, Olathe, and the entire Kansas side of the KC metro area all rely on water from the river on a daily basis, that river being the Kansas River. So when blooms are present and releases are made from Milford, water suppliers providing water to around 800,000 Kansans have to modify operations until bloom transport conditions have passed on downstream and normal operating conditions can resume. With the impacts harmful algal blooms can present to water-based recreation as well as water users, a number of groups and organizations in Kansas have expressed interest in being a part of a collaborative approach to decrease the frequency and magnitude of harmful algal blooms on Milford Lake through watershed-focused efforts to increase the adoption of conservation practices which decrease nutrient runoff and improve plant nutrient uptake, The Milford Lake Watershed RCPP provides a framework for this collaborative effort where the agricultural commodity groups and advocacy groups of the state, water utilities, water-based recreation interests, nonprofit organizations, county conservation districts, and state agencies are working together with NRCS to increase financial and technical assistance available in the lower Republican Basin for producers to implement any of a number of conservation practices which can decrease the nutrient loading which feeds the formation of harmful algal blooms in Milford Lake. For a number of project partners, this is the first time they have worked in conjunction with other certain partners with the same end goal, helping to reinforce another of the positive impacts that this RCPP program can provide. Financial support for the Milford Lake Watershed RCPP project comes from both NRCS as well as the project partnership team. NRCS, within the initial agreement period, has committed to providing $2.88 million in funding for both financial assistance and technical assistance to support project activities. The partnership team has committed to provide over $3 million in direct or in-kind support to the project through a number of actions, including but not limited to project producer outreach efforts and project promotion, as well as additional financial assistance to support enhanced program payments for certain practices. The Kansas legislature, recognizing the value and benefit of this partnership approach, has appropriated $200,000 each year from state fiscal years 2018 to 2021 to be utilized by the Kansas Water Office as our partner contribution to the project, with the final appropriation of $200,000 being a legislative priority of the Kansas Water Office to allow for a total state direct appropriation for the project to come in at a $1 million figure. So that's the end goal from a state legislative standpoint, trying to hit that $1 million mark as an overall contribution for the project. For additional details on the project, we have set a target of reducing edge of field nutrient runoff by 31,000 pounds per year of phosphorus to meet load reduction targets set forth in the EPA 319 watershed plan developed for this area through the Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy, or WRAPS program at the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. We are also utilizing the EQIP program to focus on cropland and livestock related conservation practice implementation efforts for the project area. Resource concerns addressed by the project implementation activities include excess nutrients and sediment in surface waters, as well as degraded wildlife habitat. Core practices such as those listed which are some of the most effective and efficient at decreasing nutrient runoff in this particular area, are eligible to receive a program payment rate of 90%, of which NRCS provides 75% of that payment amount, while the partnership team provides the additional 15% stacked payment. For eligible practices not classified as core practices, the current program payment rate is set at 75%. So really trying to provide a financial incentive package that is conducive to promotion and implementation of these type of nutrient reducing practices. Additional sign-up incentive payments are also available for certain wildlife habitat benefiting practices through the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism's Habitat First program. Another area where this project benefits from having a completed EPA 319 watershed plan is targeting implementation activities. Based on targeting efforts associated with watershed plan implementation and the assessments identified within that particular watershed plan, priority areas have been identified and assigned a tier value from 1 to 3 based on the areas thought to provide the most effective nutrient reduction results based on where practices are implemented, which is also reflected in the application scoring values that eligible applications submitted for the program funding received. Tier 1, or the highest priority areas, are the areas in immediate proximity to all Kansas Department of Health and Environment classified streams and Milford Lake within the project area itself. Tier 2 areas are the HUC 12 watersheds identified through SWAP modeling watershed assessment tools within the project area as being the highest nutrient loading sub-watersheds within the lower Republican Basin itself. Then the tier 3 areas are the remaining areas of the watershed. So all producers within this particular project area are eligible to submit applications and receive funding for the project, but we're attempting to target through ranking scores on the applications based off of those factors and previous assessment work that's been completed for the watershed itself. I'm not sure why it is bouncing like that on me.
Matt, if you're ready for some questions, I have one in the box for you and another question to ask all the speakers. Can you elaborate further on the Water Office's specific role within the Milford Lake RCPP? So are you the lead agency? Did you get all those partners together? How long did it take you to get those partners together? And I'm really impressed with both of the partnership slides. That's just a great illustration of, you know, what it takes to get this stuff done. But Matt, go ahead. Can you elaborate on your role?
Sure, Bevan. Yeah, so Kansas Water Office, we do serve as the lead partner for Milford Lake Watershed RCPP project. And really that was established as early on in the scoping process for the pre-proposal that was submitted. I'm really working to identify particular groups and organizations that were, I guess, maybe best equipped to bring together the overall diverse partnership team that we were looking to put together for the project itself. So in this particular project, we serve as lead partner. We help coordinate all the interactions and worked to coordinate with other partners on the recruiting of partners to the project itself. Identify particular ways that partners could contribute to the project, whether that's from a direct cash contribution standpoint or through in-kind services that they could provide in conjunction with the project itself. So that's one of the things we're, as we're sort of getting to the midway point of implementation activities, working to coordinate all those activities right now.
And so thanks. So you are the one that put the application together, but you brought all these partners together. And then do you meet with them, you know, regularly? How does that work?
Yeah, so we did submit the application, and the application we submitted was under the previous farm bill. So RCPP at that time had a pre-proposal stage and then a final proposal stage. So it was sort of a two-tiered application process that we had to go through with our project. But as far as the interaction with the overall partnership team, one of the things that we try to do in this particular area, we're fortunate to have one of the local watershed groups that's in place in this particular area too, that receives funding support through the EPA 319 program, coordinated through our Department of Health and Environment here in Kansas. So we do a lot of work to coordinate watershed activities with the Milford Lake RAPS project itself, and with the KDHE being the Clean Water Agency and having the EPA 319 program funding coming through them. We work to coordinate efforts, sort of starting at least on the water quality standpoint with those two other entities, and then bringing in the other partners from there.
All right, thanks, Matt. And if Timothy, if you could unmute the rest of the speakers, I have a few questions that are for everybody. And one question that we have in the chat box is there priority for consolidation projects like consolidation of water systems? So that might be a question for Jimmy or Ivan.
This is Jimmy. I'll take a first stab at it, and then Ivan can add to or take away from my reaction to that. And I think the term consolidation of projects really depends on what is meant by that. So if we're looking at groups of water utilities or other entities and partners that we want to work together with, some of our programs allow for a broader geographic scope, which in turn will allow us to consolidate those into more harmonious projects, as it were. If we're talking about consolidating the infrastructure of those type systems, that would be beyond the scope of NRCS.
And I believe EPA has funding for consolidation of water systems.
Correct. That would be more in their purview.
That'll be another webinar. So. All right, thanks, Jimmy. I have a few other questions. Does the watershed and the outdoor recreation program that you had mentioned earlier provide funding for outdoor recreation infrastructure in these areas like marinas or lake access structures, things like that?
So it's very interesting. And again, this authority came to us in the mid-1950s, and it gets very specific about the number of facilities based off of a variety of parameters that include, but are not limited to, the size of the watershed, the size of a reservoir, the number of people in the community, the anticipated number of visitors. And so what we've been able to do so far with that is have picnic facilities. We've been able to have campgrounds. We've been able to have other park-like facilities that include boating ramps, but not marinas in and of themselves. And so this kind of highlights when we're talking about our partnership activities, as Ivan was kind of talking about a little bit earlier, and that is generally NRCS can bring a lot of resources to the table, but it does take, as we've talked about, our partnerships in order to develop that complete package. And many times, in my experience working with city, county, state governments, they never have the resources to do everything that they would like to do, and many of those opportunities, NRCS can be those final pieces of the puzzle to make that dream a reality.
All right, great. Thanks, Jimmy. And we'll get with you and get some more information on those kinds of projects that were funded under that program, and get that information out to our network. I have one more question about the state match. So the question was, these programs require a one-to-one match, and is it possible to use other federal funds like Land and Water Conservation Fund? As we know, Congress just passed the Great American Outdoors Act, which greatly increases that funding. Is it possible to use that as a match for your federal programs, or is there a problem with using federal funds for a federal match?
Yes, so for different programs, they do have different types of matches or match that's available. The watershed program that we were just talking about does require a match from the sponsor themselves. Now, where they get that match from, and there's some other nuances that come into play, that if it originates as a federal dollar, then gets to the state and then gets to a different level of the state, at some point it loses its federal identity, and we can work on that on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm.
For the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, the other federal funds do count as a match, and that's kind of unique in all of the other federal funding mechanisms. The one prohibition we have is other USDA funds. So if we're in the western part of the country, as an example, and we're working with the U.S. Forest Service or the U.S. Forest Service as part of a broader partnership, any resources they bring to the table, we would not be able to look at those as part of a match.
Okay, so great. So I did notice in Ted, in your partnership slide, you had U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So they were able to be part of the state or the match to get those federal funds?
No, they funded a different project for us,
Okay.
nitrate study that we did in our watershed a few years back.
Okay, but Jimmy, you said for the RCPP program, federal funds can count as a match, right?
Right. So, and most other federal programs do not allow federal funds to count as a match.
Right.
So that's why I'm taking a little bit of a painstaking effort to make the distinction between other federal funds and USDA funds, and which of those can be counted as a match for RCPP and which ones cannot.
All right, great. Well, that's great nugget of information. That's something that I learned on this webinar. So always like to learn something new, and especially something that unlocks new opportunities. So Matt, you had mentioned that some of the partners in your partnership, they didn't come with a dollar match, but they were doing things like producer outreach. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what other some of the in-kind matches were, and do they count as a dollar figure when you're going to apply for your grant?
Yeah, so I guess on the application side, we did have to assign sort of a projected value to that sort of in-kind contribution. So in this particular project, we do have a handful of partners that really are equipped to be able to mobilize and send out messaging information when it comes to availability of RCPP funds, and particularly working with some of the commodity groups here in the state to engage their producer networks. So we do have the opportunity to get in-kind contribution to count in those particular type of efforts when it comes to the overall promotion and I guess administration of the project itself, whether that's through the water office or some of the, I guess, the project related activities that some of the partners are providing. So whether that's development of project website, direct producer communications, whether that's newsletters, mailings, whatnot, booths at County Conservation District annual meetings, field days, whatnot. Those are, I guess, some of the maybe kind of creative ways that some of the partners are able to still be engaged with the project and have contribution without providing direct cash to the project itself.
Great. That is so important to know, especially now as, you know, not only governments, but other corporations and nonprofits and user groups, everybody's, you know, everybody's budgets are being cut and everybody's pretty much cash strapped, but they still have lots of great networks and connections, so they could still be part of these partnerships. So I just wanted to thank all of our speakers. We need to wrap it up. We're a little bit over time, but I want to thank all of our speakers, Jimmy Bramblett from USDA, NRCS, Ted Meckes and Ivan Dozer from Illinois, and Matt Unruh from Kansas. Thank you so much for helping us unlock the keys and dive into some of the mysteries of how to land these, you know, critical funds that provide such great benefits out in the States. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Ted Meckes, who told me he is retiring next week. So we got him just in time to get him to share some of that critical information and the real keys to the partnerships and putting all this together. So to wrap it up, I think, you know, what we heard today is partnerships are really key. Get in touch with your state conservationist. partnerships to create these plans and priorities. So get in touch with your state conservationists to get involved in that. And also thanks Ivan for pointing out this is not a one-time deal. You can keep applying for these grants over and over. So I just want to thank you all and wish you all a great day. Thanks.
Thank you.